Sometimes a man thinks he's buried his heart so deep that nothing can ever reach it again. For 15 years, Jedediah Holt lived alone in his Montana mountain cabin, convinced that isolation was the only medicine for a soul that had lost everything worth living for. Then fate delivered Charlotte Whitmore to his doorstep in the worst blizzard of the winter. When he carried her unconscious body through his cabin door, something inside him awakened that he thought had died long ago. She was everything he'd sworn to avoid, a refined city woman whose very presence threatened the careful walls he'd built around his wounded heart. But the wilderness doesn't care about a man's good intentions, and neither does love. What happens when a man who has mastered survival discovers he's defenseless against the one thing he never saw coming? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The leather-bound journal sat closed on the rough-hewn table, its pages holding secrets Jedediah Holt hadn't opened in 3 years. Between those worn covers lay pressed wildflowers, mountain lupine, and Indian paintbrush, alongside pencil sketches of a woman's gentle face. Sarah's face. The journal had been his companion through the darkest nights, when memories felt like both blessing and curse. But lately, he'd found the strength to let it rest, undisturbed. Outside his cabin, the Montana wilderness stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast cathedral of pine and granite that had become his sanctuary. Snow blanketed the high country in November, transforming familiar trails into treacherous passages that only a man with 15 years of mountain wisdom could navigate safely. The nearest settlement, Copper Falls, lay 3 hard days' ride through terrain that claimed the unprepared without mercy. Jed moved through his morning routine with the practiced efficiency of a man who had reduced life to its essential elements. At 39, his body carried the lean strength of constant labor and careful living. His hands, scarred from countless tasks of survival, remained gentle when they touched the things that mattered: Thunder's muzzle, the smooth stock of his rifle, the worn spines of the few books he'd salvaged from his former life. The cabin itself stood as testament to his skill and solitude. Built from lodgepole pines he'd felled himself, chinked with mud and moss against the bitter winters, it measured 20 feet square with a stone fireplace that could warm the space through the cruelest storms. A sleeping loft, accessed by a ladder, held his bedroll and few possessions. Shelves lined the walls, holding preserved foods, ammunition, and the tools that meant the difference between survival and death in this unforgiving country. Thunder nickered softly from the small stable Jed had built adjacent to the cabin. The bay gelding had been his only companion for the past 7 years, a steady presence that asked nothing more than care and occasional conversation. Jed had learned to appreciate the horse's quiet wisdom. Thunder possessed an uncanny ability to sense weather changes and danger long before human senses detected them. The morning air bit sharp and clean as Jed stepped outside to tend his animals. His breath formed small clouds that dissipated quickly in the dry mountain atmosphere. The sky stretched pale blue above the peaks, but experience told him that conditions could change within hours. November, in the high country, demanded constant vigilance. As he forked hay for Thunder, his mind drifted to memories he usually kept carefully contained. Sarah had died 7 winters ago, along with their unborn child, victims of a fever that swept through their small Kansas farming community like wildfire. The doctors could do nothing but watch helplessly as the disease claimed young and old alike. After burying his wife and the future they'd planned together, Jed had sold their farm and ridden west, seeking emptiness vast enough to match the hollow space in his chest. The mountains had offered what he needed: silence, solitude, and challenges that demanded his full attention. Here, a man's survival depended on skill and preparation, rather than the whims of fate or the cruelties of other men. The wilderness played by rules he could understand and respect. It might kill him, but it would do so honestly, without malice or deception. He'd built this life deliberately, stripping away every unnecessary comfort and connection. His nearest neighbors, if they could be called that, lived 20 miles down the mountain. Twice a year he rode to Copper Falls for supplies, salt, ammunition, coffee, and the occasional book. The townspeople regarded him with a mixture of respect and wariness. Mountain men commanded admiration for their skills and independence, but they also carried an aura of danger that kept most folks at comfortable distance. Jed preferred it that way. Conversation required energy he'd learned to conserve for essential tasks. People brought complications, expectations, and the possibility of lost things he'd sworn to avoid after Sarah's death. Better to live simply, honestly, with only thunder for company and the changing seasons to mark the passage of time. The wind picked up as he finished his chores, carrying the scent of approaching weather. Thunder lifted his head, nostrils flaring, ears pricked forward with alert attention. Jed trusted the horse's instincts more than his own when it came to reading the mountain's moods. Something was coming, whether storm or trouble, he couldn't yet tell. Inside the cabin, he added wood to the fire and settled into his evening routine earlier than usual. The journal caught his eye again, and for a moment he considered opening it. Sarah's anniversary was approaching December 3rd, the day she'd been taken from him. Each year, the date arrived like a familiar wound, sharp but no longer surprising. Instead, he reached for a piece of pine and his carving knife. His hands found comfort in the familiar motions of shaping wood, creating small figures, wolves, eagles, bears, that captured something of the wild spirit surrounding him. These carvings were never meant for sale or display. They simply gave his hands purpose during the long winter evenings, when thoughts grew too heavy to bear alone. The wind howled around the cabin's corners now, and thunder whinnied nervously from the stable. Jed set down his carving and stepped outside to investigate. The sky had darkened dramatically, heavy clouds rolling over the peaks like grey wool being pulled across blue fabric. This would be a serious storm, the kind that could dump 3 feet of snow and trap a man for days. He made quick work of securing everything that might blow away, checking the stable door's latch and bringing in extra firewood. Inside again, he banked the fire for a long burn and settled back with his carving. The storm would rage through the night, but he was prepared. The cabin had weathered 15 winters of Montana fury, and it would weather this one too. As darkness fell and the wind's voice grew more insistent, Jed found himself thinking about the journal again. Sarah's sketched face seemed to watch him from across the small room, patient and understanding as she'd been in life. She'd always possessed the gift of silent comfort, the ability to ease his troubles without words. Sometimes he wondered what she would think of the man he'd become, harder, quieter, more careful with his heart than the young farmer who'd loved her so completely. The storm struck with full force near midnight, transforming the world outside into a maelstrom of wind and snow. Jed lay in his loft, listening to the cabin creak and settle under the assault, but he felt no fear. The structure was sound, his supplies adequate, and solitude his faithful companion. Whatever the storm might bring, he would face it as he'd faced everything else these past 15 years alone, prepared, and asking nothing from fate but the chance to endure. Yet, as sleep finally claimed him, Thunder's nervous energy from earlier lingered in his mind like a half-remembered warning. The horse had sensed something beyond mere weather, something that would arrive with the storm and change everything Jed thought he knew about the life he'd so carefully constructed. 3 hours before dawn, that something would crash into his world with a force more devastating than any blizzard, in the form of an unconscious woman whose very presence would threaten every wall he'd built around his wounded heart. The sound that woke Jedediah Holt wasn't part of the storm. Thunder's urgent whinnying cut through the wind's howl like a blade, sharp with an alarm that spoke of immediate danger. Jed rolled from his bedroll, instantly alert, and reached for the rifle that never left his side. The cabin's single window showed nothing but swirling white chaos, but something was out there, something that had spooked his usually steady horse. He pulled on his boots and heavy coat, then stepped into the maelstrom. The wind tried to steal his breath as he fought his way toward Thunder's increasingly frantic calls. Snow stung his face like thrown sand, and he could barely see 3 feet in any direction. Following the sound of his horse's distress, he stumbled forward until his hands found the stable door. Thunder was pressing against the back wall, eyes rolling white with fear. The horse's attention was fixed on something beyond the stable, something the storm had delivered to their isolated sanctuary. Jed grabbed a lantern and pushed back into the blizzard, following Thunder's gaze toward the stand of pines that bordered his small clearing. The overturned stagecoach lay like a broken beetle among the trees, its wheels spinning slowly in the wind. Snow had already begun to bury the wreckage, but Jed could make out the dark forms of what had once been horses, now still and cold. The coach's door hung open, revealing an interior filled with scattered belongings and driving snow. But it was the huddled form near the coach's rear wheel that made his heart skip. A woman's body lay motionless in the snow, her dark traveling dress already dusted white. She was small, delicate even beneath her heavy winter coat, and utterly still. For a moment, that felt like eternity. Jed thought he was looking at another victim of the mountain's casual cruelty. Then she stirred, a barely perceptible movement that might have been his imagination. But Thunder whinnied again from the stable, insistent and urgent. Jed dropped to his knees beside the woman, his rough hands searching for signs of life. Her pulse fluttered weakly beneath his fingertips, and her breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps. She was alive, but barely, and the storm was far from finished with its deadly work. Without hesitation, he scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than he'd expected, her body limp and unresisting against his chest. Even unconscious and half-frozen, there was something about her that struck him as fundamentally different from the hard-worn women he occasionally encountered in Copper Falls. Her hands, visible beneath wool gloves, were soft and uncalloused. Her face, pale with cold, held a refined beauty that spoke of protection and privilege rather than frontier hardship. The journey back to his cabin became a battle against wind and snow that seemed determined to claim them both. Jed's muscles burned with the effort of carrying her while fighting through drifts that reached his knees, but he pressed forward with grim determination. Behind them, the storm began to erase all trace of the stagecoach and its tragic cargo. Inside the cabin's blessed warmth, he laid the unconscious woman on his single chair near the fire. Her breathing remained troublingly shallow, and her skin felt cold as mountain stone beneath his touch. Hypothermia was setting in a killer, as certain as any bullet, if not treated quickly and properly. Working with the efficient care of a man who'd faced medical emergencies alone, Jed began stripping away her wet clothes. Her traveling dress was fine wool, now soaked and frozen stiff. Beneath it, layers of undergarments spoke of wealth and careful preparation for winter travel. As he worked, trying to maintain what modesty he could while saving her life, his hands discovered something that made him pause. Wrapped carefully in oilcloth and tucked into her carpet bag was a white silk dress of unmistakable purpose. A wedding gown, elaborate with lace and pearls, still pristine despite its journey. The sight of it stirred something uncomfortable in his chest, a reminder of vows and promises that belonged to a world he'd abandoned long ago. He wrapped her in his warmest blankets and moved her to his own bed in the loft, knowing that body heat was crucial for her survival. Her dark hair, freed from its proper pins, spread across his pillow like spilled ink. In the firelight, he could see that she was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 27 or 28, with delicate features that suggested a life spent far from physical hardship. As the hours passed and the storm raged outside, Jed maintained his vigil. He warmed water for her to drink when she woke, prepared hot stones to place around her body, and watched for signs of consciousness. Near dawn, her eyelids began to flutter, and she made small sounds of distress. When Charlotte Whitmore's eyes finally opened, they were the color of summer sky, a startling blue that seemed to capture light even in the cabin's dim interior. For a moment she stared at the rough log ceiling above her, confusion clouding her features. Then awareness returned like cold water, and she sat up with a gasp that became a cry of alarm. "Where am I? What happened to?" Her voice was cultured, carrying the crisp consonants of Eastern education, but it cracked with fear and exhaustion. Jed stepped into her line of sight, and her reaction was immediate and violent. She scrambled backward in the bed, clutching the blankets around her, eyes wide with terror. "Don't touch me! Stay away!" "Easy," he said, his voice deliberately calm and low. "You're safe. The stagecoach crashed in the storm. I brought you here." But Charlotte saw only a large, bearded stranger in rough clothing, standing over her in an unfamiliar place. Her mind, still foggy from hypothermia, supplied the worst possibilities. "Where are my clothes? What did you do to me?" "Saved your life," Jed replied matter-of-factly. "You were half frozen. Wet clothes would have killed you." He gestured toward her belongings, now hanging near the fire to dry. "Everything's there. Nothing was taken." She stared at him with the wariness of a trapped animal, taking in his imposing size, the rifle that leaned against the wall, the complete isolation of their situation. When she spoke again, her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I demand you take me to the nearest town immediately. My family will pay whatever you ask for my safe return." Jed almost smiled at that, the idea that money could negotiate with a Montana blizzard. "Can't take you anywhere right now. Storm's not finished, and it's 3 days hard ride to Copper Falls in good weather." The reality of her situation began to penetrate Charlotte's shock. She was alone with a strange man in the middle of nowhere, dependent on his good intentions for her very survival. Everything she'd been taught about proper behavior and self-protection seemed laughably inadequate in this raw, unforgiving place. "The other passengers," she whispered, memory returning in fragments. "The driver, the guards, are they?" "Dead," Jed said simply. There was no gentle way to deliver such news, and sugar-coating truth had never been his way. "You're the only survivor." Charlotte's composure finally cracked. She buried her face in her hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The wedding dress in her trunk represented an escape from one trap, but fate had delivered her into another that might prove far more dangerous than an unwanted marriage. Jed stood awkwardly nearby, uncertain how to comfort a crying woman after so many years of solitude. Sarah had been the last person he'd held while she wept, and that memory belonged to a different man entirely. Finally, he simply said, "You're alive. That's something." When Charlotte looked up again, tears had carved clean tracks through the dirt on her cheeks, but her eyes held a determination that surprised him. "What do you want from me?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from the fire. What did he want? He'd acted on instinct to save her life, but now she was here, in his sanctuary, disrupting the careful order of his existence. She was everything he'd deliberately avoided, beautiful, refined, connected to a world of expectations and complications he'd fled. "Nothing," he said finally. "When the storm passes and the trails are clear, I'll take you to town. Until then, you're safe here." But even as he spoke the words, Jed felt something stirring in the depths of his carefully guarded heart, something dangerous and unwelcome that whispered this woman might want everything he'd sworn never to give again. The carved wooden wolf sat on the mantelpiece like a silent witness to the tension that filled the cabin. Jed had whittled it during his second winter alone, when the solitude pressed against his mind like a physical weight. The wolf's eyes seemed to watch everything predatory, patient, waiting. Now, with Charlotte Whitmore huddled in his bed, those carved eyes seemed to mock his carefully constructed isolation. Charlotte had refused his offer of breakfast, sitting rigidly upright, with the blankets pulled to her chin like armor. Her damp hair fell in waves around her shoulders, and despite her exhaustion, she maintained the posture of a woman accustomed to proper drawing rooms rather than one-room cabins. Every few minutes, her gaze would dart to the rifle, to the door, to him calculating distances and possibilities with the desperate focus of someone planning an escape. "The storm won't break for another day, maybe two," Jed said, stirring the pot of venison stew that hung over the fire. The smell filled the small space, rich and hearty, but Charlotte's stomach remained stubbornly knotted with fear. "You need to eat something. Your body's been through enough." "I'm not hungry," she replied, though the lie was betrayed by the soft growl from her midsection. She'd eaten nothing since the stagecoach had left its last station 2 days ago, and her body was demanding fuel for recovery. Jed ladled stew into a wooden bowl and set it on the small table within her reach. "Suit yourself, but refusing food up here is a luxury you can't afford." His matter-of-fact tone irritated her more than threats might have. Charlotte was accustomed to men who either deferred to her social position or attempted to charm her with flattery. This stranger treated her with the same practical indifference he might show a wounded animal necessary to care for, but requiring no special courtesy. "You speak of luxury," she said, unable to keep the frost from her voice. "Yet you choose to live like a savage in the wilderness." The words hung in the air between them, and Charlotte immediately regretted their sharpness. Whatever this man's intentions, he had saved her life. But her fear and displacement sought an outlet, and criticism was a weapon she knew how to wield. Jed's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a brief glimpse of old pain before his features settled back into careful neutrality. "Maybe I prefer the company of savages to civilized folks." The rebuke was gentle but pointed, and Charlotte felt heat rise in her cheeks. She was behaving like a spoiled child, and some part of her recognized the injustice of it. This man had risked his own safety to pull her from the storm, had given her his bed, his warmth, his food. Her proper Boston upbringing demanded better manners, even in these impossible circumstances. "I apologize," she said quietly. "That was unkind." Jed glanced at her with surprise. In his experience, people rarely apologized for harsh words, especially those who felt themselves superior to mountain dwellers. The simple acknowledgement shifted something between them, creating a small space where conversation might be possible. "What's your name?" he asked, settling into the cabin's only chair with his own bowl of stew. "Charlotte Whitmore." She hesitated, then added, "of the Boston Whitmores." The addition was automatic, bred into her from childhood, a way of establishing her place in the world's hierarchy. Jedediah Holt. Just Jed. He didn't mention any family or connections, and Charlotte wondered if that was because he had none, or because they didn't matter in this place, where survival trumped social standing. "How long have you lived here?" she asked, genuine curiosity beginning to replace some of her fear. The cabin, while rough, showed signs of careful construction and long habitation. The man who built this place had intended to stay. 15 years, near enough. Jed took a slow spoonful of stew, considering how much of his history to share. "Came west after my wife died. Kept traveling until I found a place that felt far enough away." The simple statement carried weight that Charlotte couldn't fully grasp. She'd known loss. Her mother had died when she was 12, but she'd never experienced anything that would drive her to flee civilization entirely. "I'm sorry for your loss." Jed nodded acknowledgement but didn't elaborate. Some stories weren't meant for sharing, especially not with a stranger who would be gone from his life as soon as the trails cleared. Charlotte's gaze drifted around the cabin, taking in details she'd missed in her initial panic. Books lined, one wall not many, but carefully chosen and well read. A small collection of carved animals sat on various shelves, each one capturing some essential quality of wilderness life. The furniture was rough but sturdy, built by hands that understood both function and durability. "You built all this yourself?" she asked. "Had to. Nearest neighbor's 20 miles down the mountain, and he's not much for socializing." There was no pride in Jed's voice, just statement of fact. Building had been necessity, not accomplishment. Despite herself, Charlotte found her respect for this strange man growing. Creating a home from raw wilderness required skills she couldn't imagine possessing. In Boston, her biggest challenge had been managing household staff and planning social events. Here, survival itself was a daily achievement. The wolf carving caught her attention again, and she pointed to it. "Did you make that?" Jed's eyes followed her gesture, and for a moment his expression grew distant. "Helps pass the time during winter." He paused, then added, "That one's from my second year here. Wolves used to come around the cabin sometimes, looking for easy food. We had an understanding they stayed out of my business. I stayed out of theirs. Used to. Haven't seen a pack in 3 years now." They moved deeper into the mountains when more settlers started pushing into the lower valleys. There was something like regret in his voice, as if he'd lost old friends rather than potential threats. Charlotte studied the carving more closely. Despite its crude tools and rough materials, the wolf possessed a lifelike quality that spoke of careful observation and genuine artistry. The man who made this had watched real wolves, had understood their nature well enough to capture it in wood. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. Jed looked surprised by the compliment, as if beauty wasn't something he'd considered when creating his small sculptures. "It's just whittling." "No," Charlotte said firmly, "it's art. In Boston, people pay handsomely for work half as skilled as this." The comparison seemed to amuse rather than please him. "Different world up here. Art's what you make when you've got time left over from staying alive." His words highlighted the vast difference between their experiences. Charlotte's world was one of leisure and refinement, where art existed for its own sake. Jed's world was one of constant necessity, where beauty emerged only in the margins of survival. Yet as she watched him tend the fire with the same careful attention he'd given to carving the wolf, Charlotte began to see a different kind of artistry, the art of living deliberately, of finding purpose in simple, essential tasks. There was something appealing about the honesty of it, the direct connection between effort and result. The afternoon wore on with the storm showing no signs of abating. Charlotte finally accepted the bowl of stew, finding it surprisingly good despite its humble presentation. As warmth spread through her body and her strength began to return, she felt some of her panic receding. This man, whatever his rough exterior, had shown her nothing but careful kindness. "Why did you save me?" she asked suddenly. "You could have left me in the storm. No one would have known." Jed was quiet for a long moment, poking at the fire with an iron rod. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but certain. "Because leaving someone to die, when you could save them, makes you something less than human. No matter how far you run from civilization, you don't get to run from that." The answer revealed more about his character than hours of conversation might have done. Despite his chosen isolation, despite the walls he'd built around his wounded heart, Jedediah Holt remained fundamentally decent, a man who would risk himself for a stranger because it was simply the right thing to do. As evening shadows began to fill the cabin and the wind continued its assault on the walls, Charlotte found herself seeing her captor in an entirely different light. Perhaps she wasn't trapped with a dangerous stranger after all. Perhaps she was simply sharing shelter with a good man who'd forgotten how to trust the world with his heart. The blue hair ribbon lay between the pages of Jed's journal like a pressed flower, faded but still soft to the touch. Sarah's ribbon, the one she'd worn the morning she first took ill, when fever began its relentless claim on her life. Charlotte discovered it quite by accident when she knocked the journal from the table while trying to move closer to the fire. The book fell open, and the ribbon fluttered to the floor like a whispered secret. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, bending to retrieve both book and ribbon. "I didn't mean to." But her words died as she saw the sketches covering the open pages. A woman's face looked back at her from the yellowed paper, rendered in careful pencil strokes that spoke of deep familiarity and tender observation. The woman was beautiful in a gentle way, with kind eyes and a soft smile that seemed to radiate warmth even from the flat surface of the page. Jed's hand closed over hers as she held the ribbon, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. "That was my wife," he said simply. "Sarah." Charlotte looked from the sketch to his weathered face, seeing pain there that time had dulled, but never erased. The woman in the drawing was young, perhaps her own age, with an expression of such trust and contentment that it made Charlotte's heart ache for a stranger she'd never known. "She was lovely," Charlotte said softly, carefully placing the ribbon back between the pages where it belonged. "How long were you married?" 5 years. Jed took the journal from her hands, closing it with the reverent care of a man handling sacred relics. "Best years of my life. And I didn't know it until they were gone." The admission hung between them in the firelit cabin, raw and honest in a way that made Charlotte's chest tighten. She thought of her own engagement to Richard Pemberton, a cold arrangement born of family expectations rather than affection. Her parents had been delighted with the match, viewing it as the perfect merger of Boston's old money with newer industrial wealth. She'd felt nothing but dread. "Is that why you came here?" she asked. "To escape the memories?" Jed was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if seeking answers in the dancing flames. "Thought I was. Turns out you can't run far enough to escape yourself." He glanced at her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "What about you? What are you running from?" The question caught Charlotte off guard. She'd told herself she was simply traveling west to visit relatives, but the wedding dress in her trunk told a different story. The truth sat heavy on her tongue, years of proper upbringing warring with an unexpected desire to be honest with this man who'd shown her such unexpected gentleness. "A wedding," she said finally. "My wedding, to be precise." Jed's eyebrows rose slightly. "Man must be something special to chase you clear out to Montana territory." "He's not chasing me," Charlotte said quickly. "At least, I hope he's not. The wedding was supposed to be next month, but she took a shaky breath. "I couldn't go through with it, so I took what money I had and bought passage on the first stage heading west." "Not love then?" It wasn't a question, and Charlotte found herself grateful for his directness. In Boston society, such personal matters were approached with layers of euphemism and delicate inference. Jed's plain speaking was oddly liberating. "No, not love. Duty. Family obligation. Financial advantage." She laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Everything except the one thing that should matter most. Jed nodded slowly, understanding flickering in his expression. "Family pressure's a powerful thing, makes people do things they wouldn't choose for themselves." "Did your family approve of Sarah?" Charlotte asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. "I'm sorry, that's none of my business. Sarah was a farmer's daughter, and I was a farmer's son," Jed said without apparent offense. "Wasn't much for families to disapprove of. We chose each other because we wanted to, not because it made sense on paper." The simple statement highlighted everything that was wrong with Charlotte's own situation. Richard Pemberton was handsome enough, educated, wealthy, and entirely suitable according to every measure her family valued. He was also cold, calculating, and had made it clear that he viewed their marriage as a business transaction rather than a union of hearts. "You were fortunate," Charlotte said quietly. "To have that choice." Jed agreed. "Don't know if I'd have the courage to make it again." Something in his tone made Charlotte look at him more closely. He was watching her, with an expression she couldn't quite read, part wariness, part something that might have been longing. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with an awareness that neither had acknowledged aloud. "The storm's easing," he said suddenly, though Charlotte could still hear wind rattling the shutters. It felt like retreat, as if he'd stepped too close to some invisible line and needed to pull back. She nodded, though part of her felt disappointed by the change of subject. For a moment, they'd been sharing something real, two people who'd suffered losses, speaking honestly about pain and hope. Now the walls were going back up, and she found she missed the connection more than she'd expected. "How long before the trails are passable?" she asked. "Day, maybe 2. Depends on how much snow we got and whether the winds cleared the passes. Jed stood and moved to check the fire, but Charlotte suspected he was really putting physical distance between them. And then you'll take me to town. That's the plan. But even as he said it, Charlotte noticed the lack of conviction in his voice. Something had changed between them during their conversation about Sarah and lost love. The simple arrangement, rescue, shelter, departure, had become more complicated. Charlotte found herself studying his profile as he tended the fire. Jed was handsome in a rough way that had nothing to do with fashion or grooming. His features were strong and weathered, marked by years of mountain sun and wind. His hands were scarred but capable, moving with the confident grace of a man comfortable with physical work. There was something deeply appealing about his self-sufficiency, his quiet strength. Most of all, there was his gentleness. Despite his size and obvious capability for violence, the rifle was never far from his hand. He'd treated her with consistent kindness. When he'd changed her wet clothes to save her life, he'd been respectful and matter-of-fact. When she'd been frightened and rude, he'd responded with patience rather than anger. "Jed," she said impulsively, then stopped, uncertain what she'd meant to say. He turned from the fire, and their eyes met across the small space of the cabin. The moment stretched between them, full of possibilities neither was ready to name. Charlotte felt something flutter in her chest, not fear this time, but something warmer and more dangerous. "What is it?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. "Nothing," she said quickly, but she couldn't look away from his face. "Just thank you for everything." Jed nodded slowly, but his eyes remained fixed on hers. "You don't need to thank me, Charlotte." The way he said her name sent a small shiver through her that had nothing to do with cold. When had she given him permission to use her first name? When had the formal distance between them dissolved into something more intimate? Outside, the wind continued its assault on the cabin walls, but inside, the space felt suddenly too small, too warm, too charged with unspoken possibilities. Charlotte was acutely aware of her borrowed nightshirt, of the way Jed's presence seemed to fill the room, of the dangerous path her thoughts were taking. She was a woman fleeing an unwanted marriage, and he was a man still grieving his lost wife. Neither of them was prepared for the attraction that was growing between them like a fire that had found dry kindling. But as the storm raged outside and the night deepened around them, Charlotte began to wonder if some forces of nature were simply too powerful to resist. Charlotte's teaching primer sat open on the rough table, its pages a stark reminder of the civilized world she'd left behind. Moral instruction for young ladies, read the chapter header, followed by paragraphs about proper deportment, suitable conversation, and the importance of maintaining virtue in all circumstances. The irony wasn't lost on her as she sat in a mountain cabin wearing a man's shirt, her hair loose around her shoulders, sharing space with a stranger who made her pulse quicken in ways her proper Boston education had never addressed. The storm had finally broken during the night, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. Through the cabin's single window, Charlotte could see that the drifts reached nearly to the roof in some places. The wilderness stretched endlessly white under a pale morning sun, beautiful and terrifying in its vastness. "We'll be here a few more days," Jed said, returning from his morning check on Thunder. Snow clung to his coat and beard, and his cheeks were ruddy from the cold. "Trail down the mountains blocked. I'll need to dig us out before we can travel." Charlotte nodded, trying to ignore the small flutter of something that might have been relief. The prospect of staying longer should have frightened her, but instead she felt a curious sense of disappointment at the thought of eventually leaving this place and him. "Is there anything I can do to help?" she asked, closing the primer and setting it aside. Jed looked surprised by the offer. "You ever done any real work?" The question might have been insulting from another man, but she could hear genuine curiosity rather than mockery in his tone. "Define real work," she said with a wry smile. "Splitting wood, hauling water, cooking over an open fire." He gestured around the cabin, things that keep you alive rather than just occupied. Charlotte considered this honestly. Her days in Boston had been filled with activities, music lessons, French conversation, charity committee meetings, social calls, but none of them had been essential for survival. She admitted, "I haven't. Might be time to learn." There was something in his voice, a subtle invitation that went beyond mere practicality. Charlotte realized he was offering to share his world with her, to teach her the skills that had kept him alive in this harsh country. The thought both excited and terrified her. "I'd like that," she said quietly. The morning began with lessons in basic fire management. Charlotte learned that maintaining heat in a cabin required more than simply throwing logs onto flames. She had to understand how different woods burned, how to bank coals for overnight warmth, how to read the subtle signs that told her when to add fuel and when to let the fire breathe. Her first attempts were clumsy, earning gentle corrections from Jed as he showed her how to position kindling for maximum efficiency. When his hands covered hers to guide the placement of a split log, Charlotte felt heat that had nothing to do with the fire. His touch was work-roughened but careful, and she found herself stealing glances at his profile as he concentrated on the lesson. "Fire's like everything else up here," he said, stepping back to let her tend the flames alone. "Respect it, understand it, and it'll keep you alive. Take it for granted, and it'll kill you." The words carried weight beyond their literal meaning, and Charlotte wondered if he was talking about more than fire safety. Everything in this place seemed to demand respect and understanding: the weather, the terrain, the animals, and perhaps the man himself. By midday, she'd graduated to helping prepare their simple meal. Charlotte had never cooked anything more complex than tea in her life, but Jed guided her through the process of turning basic ingredients into nourishing food. His instructions were patient and clear, though she could see him biting back amusement when she seasoned the venison stew with far too much salt. "It's edible," he pronounced after tasting her efforts, though his expression suggested charity in the judgment. "You're very kind," Charlotte said dryly. "In Boston, I was considered quite accomplished. Different accomplishments up here." Jed took another spoonful, and this time his expression showed genuine approval. "But you're learning fast. Some folks never get the hang of mountain cooking." The compliment, modest as it was, pleased her more than any praise she'd received for her watercolor paintings or piano performances. This was functional skill, knowledge that mattered in ways that social graces never could. As the afternoon wore on, Charlotte found herself watching Jed with growing fascination. Everything he did was purposeful, efficient, born of long experience and hard-won wisdom. When he repaired a loose board in the cabin wall, his movements were economical and sure. When he checked his traps for fresh meat, he read the forest like a book written in tracks and signs she couldn't begin to decipher. "How do you know so much?" she asked, as they returned from collecting snow to melt for water. The simple task had required navigation through chest-deep drifts, and Charlotte was breathing hard from the effort. 15 years of making mistakes," Jed said simply. "The mountains teach hard lessons, but they stick with you." "Did you always want to live this way?" Jed was quiet for a moment, considering the question as they trudged back toward the cabin. "No," he said finally. "When I was young, I had different dreams. Farm, wife, children, simple life, but not this simple." "Do you regret it? Coming here, I mean." "Used to. Spent the first few years angry at God, at fate, at myself for not being able to save Sarah." His breath formed small clouds in the cold air. "But anger's a luxury you can't afford when survival takes everything you've got. Eventually, I stopped looking backward and started living in the present." Charlotte pondered this as they reached the cabin. She'd spent most of her life looking forward to marriage, to social position, to a future mapped out by family expectations. The idea of living purely in the present, of finding peace in simple daily tasks, was both foreign and appealing. Inside the cabin's warmth, she settled into the chair near the fire, while Jed tended to various maintenance tasks. The teaching primer caught her eye again, and she picked it up with new perspective. The moral instructions that had once seemed important now felt artificial, disconnected from the real business of living. "What are you reading?" Jed asked, noticing her frown. "Lessons for young ladies," Charlotte said, then read aloud. "A woman's highest calling is to provide moral guidance and spiritual comfort to her family, maintaining at all times the delicate sensibilities that distinguish the gentler sex from the rougher elements of society." Jed snorted softly. "Whoever wrote that never met a mountain woman." Mountain women? Wives of miners, trappers, homesteaders. Women who can shoot as straight as their husbands, who've delivered babies and buried children and fought off bears to protect their families. His expression grew thoughtful. "They're gentle when gentleness serves, and hard as nails when hardness is needed. Most refined thing about them is their judgment." Charlotte tried to imagine herself as such a woman and found the idea both daunting and strangely attractive. "Do you think I could become someone like that?" Jed looked at her carefully, taking in her earnest expression, her willingness to learn, the way she'd adapted to circumstances that would have broken many people of her background. "I think you're stronger than you know," he said finally. "Question is whether you want to find out how strong." The conversation was interrupted by a sound outside, thunder whinnying with alarm. Jed was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, moving to the window, with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to danger. "What is it?" Charlotte whispered. "Don't know yet." Jed's voice was tense, alert. "Could be wolves, or—" The sound came again, but this time Charlotte recognized it. Not a wolf's howl, but a human voice calling through the snow. Someone was out there, searching, and her heart clenched with sudden fear. Had her family sent searchers? Had Richard refused to accept her flight and demanded pursuit? "Stay here," Jed ordered, but Charlotte was already moving toward the door. "No," she said firmly. "If they're looking for me, hiding will only make things worse." But when Jed opened the cabin door, the figure stumbling through the snow wasn't a searcher sent by her family. It was a lone prospector, half frozen and delirious, calling out for help in a voice cracked by cold and desperation. Jed immediately went to the man's aid, and Charlotte found herself helping to bring another stranger into their sanctuary. As they worked together to save the prospector's life, Charlotte realized that her question about becoming a mountain woman was already being answered. She was discovering strength she'd never known she possessed, finding purpose in work that mattered. And with each passing hour in Jed's company, she was learning that some lessons couldn't be found in any primer, they could only be lived. Jed's father's pocket watch sat silent in his palm, its hands frozen at 3:17, the exact moment Sarah had drawn her last breath 7 years ago. He'd stopped the watch deliberately that terrible morning, unable to bear the thought of time continuing without her. Now, as he sat by the dying fire while Charlotte slept in the loft above, he found himself staring at the timepiece and wondering if hearts, like watches, could be wound again after years of stillness. The prospector they'd rescued 3 days earlier had recovered enough to continue his journey, but his brief presence had changed something fundamental in the cabin's atmosphere. Charlotte had worked tirelessly to nurse the man back to health, displaying a competence and strength that surprised them both. When she'd knelt beside the stranger's makeshift bed, cleaning his wounds with gentle efficiency, Jed had seen glimpses of the woman she might become, not the refined Boston lady, but someone harder and more essential. "You're awake." Charlotte's soft voice came from the loft's edge, and Jed looked up to see her peering down at him through the railings. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted, closing the watch and slipping it back into his pocket. She climbed down the ladder with growing confidence, no longer the helpless city woman who'd arrived in the storm. Her movements had adapted to the cabin's rhythms, becoming more economical and sure. The borrowed clothes, his spare shirt, and the pants they'd altered to fit her smaller frame had replaced the fine traveling dress, and somehow the rough garments suited her better than silk ever had. "Is something wrong?" she asked, settling into the chair across from him. Jed considered the question. Something was definitely wrong, but not in the way she meant. The careful isolation he'd maintained for 15 years was crumbling, and he felt powerless to stop it. Worse, he wasn't certain he wanted to stop it. "Spring's coming," he said instead. "Another month, maybe 6 weeks, and the high passes will be clear." Charlotte nodded, understanding the implication. When spring arrived, their enforced proximity would end. She would return to civilization, and he would resume his solitary existence. The thought should have brought relief, but instead, it settled in his chest like a stone. "I've been thinking about that," she said quietly. "About what happens when the snow melts. You'll go to Copper Falls, catch the next stage east, back to your family, your old life." The words tasted bitter as he spoke them. "Will I?" Charlotte's voice carried a note of challenge. "What if I don't want to go back?" Jed's heart skipped, but he forced himself to meet her gaze steadily. "Your family will be worried. They'll have search parties out as soon as the weather permits. Let them search." There was steel in her voice now, a determination that reminded him of mountain women he'd known. "I'm not a child. Jed, I'm 27 years old, and I have the right to choose my own path." "And what path is that?" he asked, though part of him feared the answer. Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire's dying embers. When she spoke, her words came slowly, as if she were discovering them as she said them. "I don't know yet, but I know it's not in Boston, married to a man I don't love, living a life that feels like a beautiful prison." The firelight played across her face, highlighting the changes that weeks in the mountains had wrought. Her skin had lost its porcelain pallor, taking on the healthy color of someone who worked outdoors. Her hands, once soft and useless, now bore small calluses from splitting wood and hauling water. Most significantly, her eyes held a confidence that hadn't been there when she'd first awakened in his cabin. "This isn't an easy life," Jed said carefully. "The mountains don't care about your good intentions or your determination. They'll kill you for a moment's carelessness. You could teach me." The words hung between them, full of possibility and danger. "You could show me how to survive here." Jed felt something crack inside his chest, not breaking, but opening, like ice giving way to spring water. The watch in his pocket seemed to pulse with sudden life, as if time itself were starting to move again after years of stillness. "Charlotte," he said, her name rough in his throat. "I know it's asking a lot," she continued, leaning forward in her chair. "I know I'm not like the women you're used to. But I'm learning, Jed. I'm changing, and I think I could be happy here. With you." The admission hung in the air between them, brave and vulnerable and terrifying in its honesty. Jed found himself looking at her, really looking and seeing not the refined lady who'd arrived in the storm, but a woman of growing strength and quiet beauty who'd somehow become essential to his carefully ordered world. "I can't control myself around you," he said suddenly, the words escaping before he could stop them. Charlotte's breath caught. "What do you mean?" Jed stood abruptly, pacing to the window, as if distance could provide safety from the feelings coursing through him. "I mean, you make me want things I gave up years ago. You make me remember what it felt like to hope for a future instead of just enduring the present." "Is that so terrible?" "It is when I have nothing to offer you but hardship and isolation." He turned to face her, his expression fierce with internal struggle. "You deserve better than a broken-down mountain man who's forgotten how to live with other people." Charlotte rose from her chair, moving toward him with deliberate steps. "Don't I get to decide what I deserve? You don't understand what you'd be giving up, don't I?" Her voice carried heat now, frustration at his assumptions about her desires and capabilities. "I've lived that life, Jed. I've had the fine clothes and the social position and the endless round of meaningless activities that filled my days without feeding my soul. I've been treated like a delicate ornament, valued for my appearance and my connections rather than who I am as a person." She stopped directly in front of him, close enough that he could see the golden flecks in her blue eyes. "These past weeks, working beside you, learning from you, I've felt more alive than I ever did in Boston. More useful, more myself." Jed's resolve wavered as he looked down at her upturned face. The firelight caught the copper highlights in her dark hair, and he found himself remembering how soft those strands had felt when he'd carried her unconscious form from the storm. How right she'd looked, sleeping in his bed. How natural it had seemed to wake and find her there. "I'm 15 years older than you," he said, grasping for rational objections to the impossible thing she was suggesting. "So? I'm set in my ways, difficult to live with. I'll adapt. You don't know what winter's really like here. Months of isolation, storms that last for weeks." "Then teach me." Charlotte reached up and touched his face, her palm warm against his bearded cheek. "Teach me everything I need to know to survive here, to thrive here, with you." The touch shattered the last of his defenses. With a sound that was half groan, half surrender, Jed pulled her against him, his arms encircling her small frame, as if she was something precious he'd thought lost forever. Charlotte melted into his embrace, her face pressed against his chest, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and leather, and the indefinable essence that was uniquely him. "I'm scared," he whispered into her hair. "I lost everything once before. I don't know if I could survive losing you too." "You won't lose me," Charlotte said fiercely, pulling back to meet his eyes. "I'm not going anywhere, Jed. I'm exactly where I want to be." When he kissed her, it was with the desperate hunger of a man long starved for tenderness. Charlotte responded with equal passion, her hands fisting in his shirt, as if she could anchor them both to this moment, this decision, this turning point that would change everything. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying the promise of spring and new beginnings. Inside the cabin, two wounded souls found healing in each other's arms, discovering that some forms of salvation could only be found in the wilderness of the human heart. The wanted poster was weathered and torn, but the face drawn in stark black ink was unmistakably Jed's younger, clean-shaven, but definitely him. Charlotte stared at the paper that had fallen from the saddlebags of one of the three men now surrounding their cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs as she read the words that changed everything. Wanted for murder, Jedediah Holt, formerly of Lawrence, Kansas. 500 reward. Considered armed and extremely dangerous. The lead rider, a tall man with cruel eyes and a badge that caught the morning sunlight, called out from his position near the stable. "We know you're in there, Holt. And we know you've got the Whitmore girl. Come out with your hands up, and maybe we can settle this peaceful-like." Charlotte's blood ran cold at the casual mention of her name. These weren't just bounty hunters seeking Jed, they'd been sent for her as well. The comfortable world she and Jed had built over the past month shattered like ice struck by a hammer. Inside the cabin, Jed stood frozen by the window, his rifle in his hands but his face grey with something that looked like defeat. "I should have told you," he said quietly, not meeting her eyes. "Told me what?" Charlotte's voice was barely a whisper. "About Kansas, about why I really came to the mountains." Jed's knuckles were white where he gripped the rifle. There was a man named Richard Pemberton. Charlotte's world tilted. "Richard Pemberton? My Richard Pemberton?" Jed's head snapped toward her, surprise replacing resignation in his expression. "Your what?" "My fiancé, the man I ran away from marrying." Charlotte felt sick, pieces of a terrible puzzle clicking into place. What does he have to do with this? Before Jed could answer, the lead rider's voice cut through the morning air again. "Time's running short, Holt. Mr. Pemberton wants his property back, and he's not a patient man. The girl comes with us, and you get to face justice for what you did to his partner." "His partner," Charlotte repeated, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. Jed closed his eyes briefly, then opened them to meet her stare. "Thomas Pemberton, Richard's cousin. I was accused of killing him in a claim dispute outside Lawrence 7 years ago. The timeline struck Charlotte like a physical blow. 7 years ago, the same time Sarah died. Just after. Jed's voice was hollow. I was grieving, not thinking straight. When Thomas Pemberton tried to force me off land that had been in my family for 20 years, using legal papers that were clearly forged, I fought back. But when the smoke cleared, he was dead, and I was the only one left alive to tell the story. But you didn't kill him, Charlotte said with sudden certainty. She knew this man, had seen his gentleness, his careful respect for life. Whatever had happened in Kansas, murder wasn't in his nature. No, Jed said simply, but his cousin Richard convinced the sheriff I did. Had witnesses who swore they saw me shoot Thomas in cold blood. I barely escaped with my life. Charlotte's mind raced, connecting threads she'd never seen before. Richard's eagerness to marry her, despite their brief acquaintance. His family's sudden wealth that had appeared around the same time she'd now learned Jed had fled Kansas. The way he'd always spoken about justice and law, as if they were tools to be wielded, rather than principles to be honored. He's been looking for you all these years, she said, understanding flooding through her. And when I ran away, he realized who you might have encountered. Jed finished grimly. Mountain men talk to each other, even if we're spread out. Word gets around about who's living where. It wouldn't take much investigation to connect Charlotte Whitmore's disappearance to Jedediah Holt's hideout. The pieces of Richard's manipulation became clear, with sickening clarity. He'd courted her not for love or even financial advantage, but because her family's connections could help him track down the man he believed had killed his cousin. Her flight from their engagement had simply provided him with the perfect excuse to follow the trail west. We got your woman out here, Holt. Another voice called from outside. Pretty thing. All dressed up in her traveling clothes, Mr. Pemberton's real eager to be reunited with his bride. Charlotte's blood turned to ice. A fourth rider had circled around behind the cabin while they'd been talking, and through the back window she could see him holding someone, a woman in a blue traveling dress, bound and gagged, but clearly not her. They have someone else, she whispered. Some innocent woman they think is me. Jed cursed under his breath, the first truly harsh language she'd heard from him. Sarah Hutchins, he said after peering through the window. Schoolteacher from Copper Falls. Looks enough like you from a distance to fool them. The moral complexity of their situation hit Charlotte like a landslide. If she revealed herself to save the innocent woman, she'd be delivering herself back to Richard and his web of lies. But if she stayed hidden, Sarah Hutchins would suffer for sins that weren't her own. There's something else, Jed said quietly, his expression grim. Something I should have realized sooner. What? If Richard's been hunting me for 7 years, and if he's gone to this much trouble to track me down, it's not just about justice for his cousin's death. Jed's voice carried the weight of terrible understanding. Thomas Pemberton was murdered, all right, but not by me. Charlotte felt the world shift again beneath her feet. You think Richard? I think Richard killed his own cousin and needed someone to blame for it. And I think whatever Thomas discovered about his business dealings was worth killing to keep secret. Jed's jaw tightened with anger. Which means we're not just dealing with bounty hunters looking for a fugitive. We're dealing with a murderer who's been covering his tracks for 7 years. The sound of horses moving closer galvanized them both into action. Charlotte grabbed the wanted poster and stuffed it into her shirt, evidence that might prove crucial later. Jed checked his rifle and moved to the gun port he'd cut in the cabin's wall years earlier for just such emergencies. Can we get to Sarah? Charlotte asked, her mind already working on rescue possibilities. Not without exposing ourselves completely, Jed said. They've got her positioned where any move we make will put her in the line of fire. Then we have to be smarter than they are. Charlotte's voice carried a determination that would have surprised her Boston acquaintances. You know this country better than anyone. There has to be a way. Jed looked at her with something approaching admiration. You're talking about a fight, Charlotte. These aren't civilized men playing by gentlemen's rules. They'll kill without hesitation if they think it serves their purpose. Then we'll have to make sure they don't get the chance. Charlotte moved to stand beside him at the gun port, her shoulder touching his arm. You said the mountains teach hard lessons. Teach me this one. Outside, the lead rider was growing impatient. Last chance, Holt. Come out now, or we start making this unpleasant for everyone involved. Jed's hand found Charlotte's, squeezing gently. I need you to know something, he said quietly. Whatever happens here, these past weeks with you have been the best of my life since Sarah died. You brought me back to life, Charlotte. Don't ever forget that. Nothing's going to happen to us, she said fiercely. We're going to get out of this, save that innocent woman, and expose Richard for what he really is. But even as she spoke the brave words, Charlotte could see the terrible odds they faced. 4 armed men against 2, with an innocent hostage complicating every possible strategy. The cabin that had been their sanctuary was about to become their fortress, and the love they'd discovered in the wilderness would be tested by violence and betrayal. The war for their future was about to begin, and Charlotte could only pray that the skills Jed had taught her about survival would be enough to see them through the darkest fight of their lives. The hidden Winchester rifle emerged from its oilcloth, wrapping like a deadly secret, finally exposed to light. Jed's hands moved over the weapon with practiced efficiency, checking the action, counting ammunition, preparing for the kind of violence he'd hoped never to face again. The rifle had been his companion during the war, and later during his desperate flight from Kansas, but for 15 years it had remained wrapped and hidden beneath his cabin's floorboards. How many rounds? Charlotte asked quietly, watching him work with the focused intensity of someone whose life might depend on the answer. 47. Jed's voice was calm, but Charlotte could see the tension in his shoulders. More than enough, if I use them right. Outside, the bounty hunters had settled into positions around the cabin, confident in their advantage, but wary of Jed's reputation. The leader, who'd identified himself as Marshal Jake Coleman, kept calling out demands and threats, but Jed could hear the uncertainty beneath the bluster. These men knew they were dealing with someone dangerous, even if they didn't understand exactly how dangerous. What about Sarah Hutchins? Charlotte peered through the back window at the innocent schoolteacher who remained bound and guarded 50 yards away. We can't let her suffer for our fight. We won't, Jed said firmly. But rescuing her means getting past their guard, and that's not happening while they've got us pinned down here. Charlotte nodded, her mind working through possibilities with the strategic thinking she'd never needed in Boston drawing rooms. What if we make them come to us instead? Jed glanced at her with surprise. Explain. They want me alive, Richard made that clear. And they want you alive too, or at least they want to be able to prove they killed the right man. Charlotte's voice grew more confident as she developed her idea. That means they can't just burn us out or shoot randomly through the walls. They have to take us intact. So they'll have to come in eventually, and when they do, we'll be ready for them. Charlotte moved to the cabin's main room, studying angles and cover with eyes that had learned to see tactically. This place is built like a fortress, only one door, windows too small for a man to climb through easily, and we know every inch of it. Jed followed her reasoning with growing admiration. You're thinking of making them fight on our terms instead of theirs. Exactly. Charlotte's transformation from refined lady to mountain strategist was complete. But we need to make sure Sarah is safe first. Can you hit her guard from here? Jed moved to the gun port and studied the distance carefully. It's a long shot, and if I miss, you won't miss. Charlotte's confidence in his abilities was absolute. I've watched you hunt. You don't take shots you can't make. The trust in her voice steadied something in Jed's chest. He'd been alone for so long that having someone believe in his capabilities felt like a gift he'd forgotten how to receive. After I take the shot, they'll know exactly where we are. Things will get violent fast. I understand. Charlotte checked the smaller rifle Jed had taught her to use for hunting. "What do you need me to do?" Jed looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the helpless city woman who'd arrived in the storm, but a partner who could be counted on when everything mattered most. "Watch the door. Anyone who comes through uninvited, you shoot. Don't hesitate. Don't try to wound them. These men won't show you mercy, so don't show them any." Charlotte nodded grimly. "What about after? When it's over?" "Depends on how it ends." Jed's expression was grim but determined. "If we survive this, we're going to have to deal with Richard Pemberton. He's the snake's head. Cutting off the tail won't stop the poison. He'll face justice for what he did to your family and for what he tried to do to us." Charlotte's voice carried steel that would have surprised anyone who'd known her in Boston. "I know people back east, Jed, people with influence and connections. When they hear the truth about Richard's crimes, if we live to tell it, we will." Charlotte moved to stand beside him, her hand covering his on the rifle stock. "We have to. Too many innocent people have suffered for his lies already." Jed squeezed her hand gently, then moved into position at the gun port. "When I fire, they'll scatter for cover. That's when Sarah has her best chance to run. You watch for my signal, then cover me while I go after her." "Jed." Charlotte's voice stopped him as he sighted down the rifle barrel. "I love you." The words hit him harder than enemy fire ever had. Jed turned from his shooting position to look at her, seeing everything he'd thought lost forever reflected in her blue eyes: hope, trust, and a love that had grown strong enough to face death itself. "I love you too," he said simply, "more than I thought possible after Sarah." "Then we're going to survive this," Charlotte said fiercely, "because I'm not losing you now that I've found you." Outside, Marshal Coleman's patience was wearing thin. "Your time's up, Holt. We're coming in." Jed returned to his shooting position, centering the rifle's sights on the guard, holding Sarah Hutchins. The man was young, nervous, scanning the cabin windows with the twitchy alertness of someone who knew he was exposed. One clean shot would drop him and give Sarah her chance. "Ready?" Jed asked softly. Charlotte took position by the door, her rifle trained on the entrance. "Ready." The moment stretched like a held breath, full of potential and consequence. Everything they'd built together, their love, their plans, their dreams of a future in the mountains, balanced on the edge of violence that could destroy or deliver them. "Now," Jed whispered and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked across the morning air like thunder, and chaos erupted around the cabin. The young guard spun and fell. Sarah Hutchins scrambled for the cover of nearby trees, and the remaining 3 bounty hunters dove for position while shouting conflicting orders at each other. "Sarah's clear," Charlotte called out, watching the schoolteacher disappear into the forest. "She's running for town." But their victory was short-lived. Marshal Coleman had rallied his men faster than expected, and now they were advancing on the cabin from 3 directions, using the terrain for cover while maintaining a crossfire that would make any escape attempt suicidal. "They're professional," Jed observed grimly, watching their coordinated approach. "This isn't going to be as easy as I hoped." "Nothing worth having ever is," Charlotte replied, and despite everything, Jed found himself smiling at her unshakable determination. The first bullets began striking the cabin walls, probing shots designed to test their defenses and force them to reveal their positions. Jed answered with carefully aimed fire that kept the attackers honest, but he could see the tactical problem developing. They had limited ammunition and no escape route, while their enemies had time, numbers, and the luxury of being able to call for reinforcements. "There's something else," Charlotte said during a brief lull in the firing. "Something I should have thought of earlier." "What?" "Richard doesn't just want you dead, he wants you discredited. If these men kill you here, he can claim you died resisting arrest for your cousin's murder. But if you can prove your innocence, how?" Jed's question was punctuated by another volley of shots against the cabin walls. Charlotte reached into her shirt and pulled out the wanted poster she'd hidden earlier. "This poster is signed by Sheriff Morrison of Lawrence County, Kansas. But I've seen Richard's handwriting, Jed. I've seen it hundreds of times on social invitations and business correspondence. She pointed to the signature at the bottom of the poster. That's not Sheriff Morrison's signature. That's Richard's, disguised but recognizable, if you know what to look for. He's been forging legal documents this whole time. Jed stared at the poster with new understanding. Evidence. Evidence that could clear your name and expose him for the murderer he really is. Charlotte's eyes blazed with righteous anger, but only if we survive long enough to present it. The sound of splintering wood announced that their attackers had escalated their assault. The cabin door shuddered under the impact of something heavy, an axe or sledgehammer, wielded by someone determined to breach their defenses. "Time's up," Jed said, raising his rifle toward the door. "Here they come." Charlotte moved to her position, heart hammering but hands steady on her weapon. Outside, Marshal Coleman was shouting final warnings that meant nothing, legal justifications for the violence about to unfold. The door exploded inward in a shower of splinters and metal, and the final battle for their future began in earnest. Everything they'd learned about survival, about love, about standing together against impossible odds, would be tested in the next few minutes of gunfire and desperation. But as the first figure appeared in the ruined doorway, Charlotte felt no fear, only fierce determination to protect the life she'd built with the man she loved, no matter what the cost. Charlotte's torn petticoat lay in strips across the cabin floor, transformed from feminine finery into makeshift bandages that now bound Jed's wounded shoulder. The first assault had been repelled, but at a cost. Marshal Coleman's men had gotten closer than expected, and one lucky shot had found its mark before Jed's return fire had driven them back. "How bad?" Charlotte asked, tying off the last strip of fabric with hands that remained remarkably steady despite the chaos of the past hour. "I'll live," Jed said through gritted teeth, flexing his left arm to test the damage. The bullet had torn through muscle without hitting bone, painful but not incapacitating. "Though I'm going to be slower on this side," Charlotte nodded, already adjusting their defensive strategy to account for his injury. The transformation from sheltered lady to capable partner was complete. She'd crossed a line during the fighting that could never be uncrossed, and both of them knew it. Two of Coleman's men lay dead outside the cabin, testament to Jed's deadly accuracy and Charlotte's surprising competence with a rifle. But Coleman himself remained alive, along with one other gunman, and their fury at being outfought by their quarry had made them reckless and dangerous. "They'll try again soon," Jed observed, reloading his Winchester with methodical care. "Coleman's the type who takes losses personally." As if summoned by his words, the marshal's voice rang out from behind the overturned supply wagon he dragged into position for cover. "You killed good men in there, Holt, men with families waiting for them back home. Men who came to murder an innocent man," Charlotte called back before Jed could stop her. Her voice carried across the battlefield with surprising authority. "Men who were willing to kill for Richard Pemberton's blood money." The silence that followed her outburst stretched long enough to make Jed worry they'd revealed too much. But when Coleman spoke again, his tone had shifted from righteous anger to calculating interest. "So the lady knows what this is really about," he said. "Richard said you might have poisoned her mind with lies about his family. The only lies are the ones Richard's been telling for 7 years. Charlotte's anger burned bright and clean, fueled by everything she'd learned about the man she'd almost married. Thomas Pemberton was murdered, all right, by his own cousin. Another long silence, then Coleman's laugh, ugly and knowing. "You think I don't know that, girl? You think any of us believed that wanted poster was legitimate?" The admission hit Charlotte like a physical blow. These weren't lawmen seeking justice, they were hired killers who knew exactly what crimes they were covering up. "Then why?" she called out, though part of her already understood the answer. "Because Richard Pemberton pays better than honest work," Coleman replied without shame, "and because dead men don't file appeals or hire lawyers to investigate old murders." Jed's jaw tightened with fury, but his voice remained controlled when he spoke. What about the school teacher? She did nothing to earn your violence. Collateral damage, Coleman said dismissively. Though it worked out well enough, gave us a way to flush you out. The casual cruelty of the statement revealed everything Charlotte needed to know about the men they were fighting. These weren't misguided lawmen or even ordinary criminals. They were killers who would murder anyone who stood between them and their payment. "They're not going to let us walk away from this," she said quietly to Jed. "Even if we surrender, they'll kill us both to keep us quiet." "I know." Jed's expression was grim but determined. "Which means we end this here, one way or another." The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the cabin windows, casting long shadows that would soon provide cover for their enemy's next assault. Jed could see Coleman moving behind his makeshift barricade, probably planning his final attack for the moment when darkness gave him the advantage. "There's something I need to tell you," Charlotte said suddenly, her voice urgent. "About Richard. About why he's so desperate to find you. It can wait." "No, it can't." Charlotte gripped his uninjured arm. "Jed, I think Thomas Pemberton discovered something about Richard's business dealings, something worth killing for." Jed's attention sharpened. "What kind of something?" "My father mentioned it once, how the Pemberton fortune seemed to appear overnight. How Richard went from being a clerk in his uncle's law office to owning half the commercial district in Kansas City." Charlotte's mind raced through fragments of overheard conversations and suspicious connections. What if Thomas found evidence that Richard was stealing from their clients? Or worse, land fraud, Jed said with sudden understanding. "That forged deed he tried to use on my farm. What if that wasn't the first time?" The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Richard hadn't just killed his cousin to steal Jed's land. He'd been running a systematic scheme to defraud homesteaders across Kansas territory, using his position as a lawyer to forge documents and steal property. Thomas must have discovered the extent of his cousin's crimes and threatened to expose him. "He's not just covering up one murder," Charlotte whispered. "He's protecting an entire criminal empire." A sound outside interrupted their conversation, the scrape of metal on stone, the careful whisper of someone moving closer to the cabin under cover of the growing shadows. Coleman was making his move, and this time he wouldn't be taking chances. "Get ready," Jed murmured, moving to the gun port despite the pain in his shoulder. "This is going to be their final push." Charlotte took position by the back window, watching for flanking movements while keeping her rifle ready. The waiting stretched taut between them, heavy with the knowledge that the next few minutes would determine whether they lived to expose Richard's crimes or died as his final victims. "Charlotte," Jed said softly, not taking his eyes from the approaching danger. "Yes? If something happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you." Her voice was fierce with determination. "But if it does," he continued quietly, "promise me you'll get that evidence to the authorities. Real authorities, not more of Richard's hired guns." Charlotte's throat tightened, but she nodded. "I promise. But we're both getting out of this alive, Jed. We have too much to live for now." The shadow, moving along the cabin's east wall, suddenly broke into a run, and Jed's rifle spoke with deadly authority. But even as the attacker fell, Charlotte caught movement at the back window, Coleman's remaining man trying to breach their defenses from behind. Her shot took him center mass, and he crumpled without a sound. But the victory felt hollow, because somewhere in the lengthening shadows, Marshal Coleman was still out there, wounded and desperate and more dangerous than ever. "One left," Jed said grimly. "The most dangerous one," Charlotte replied, and settled in to wait for the final confrontation that would decide their fate. The wedding ring slipped from Jed's finger as he reloaded his rifle, the simple gold band that had bound him to Sarah's memory for 7 long years, finally released. It rolled across the cabin floor and came to rest against Charlotte's boot, a small, symbolic gesture that spoke of endings and new beginnings in the midst of their desperate fight for survival. Charlotte glanced down at the ring, understanding its significance even as she kept watch for Coleman's next move. That small circle of gold represented Jed's past, his grief, and his long journey back to the possibility of love. Seeing him remove it voluntarily told her everything about his commitment to their future if they lived to have one. "He's circling around to the front," Jed said quietly, tracking Coleman's movements through the gun port, trying to get an angle on the door. "Let him come," Charlotte replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "We know this cabin better than he does." But Coleman proved more cunning than expected. Instead of a direct assault, he began lobbing burning brands onto the cabin roof, hoping to smoke them out or force them to abandon their defensive positions. The smell of burning wood filled the air, and Charlotte could hear the ominous crackle of flames taking hold above their heads. "Fire," Jed said grimly. "Should have expected that." "How long do we have?" Charlotte asked, already moving to grab the water bucket they kept by the fire. "Not long enough." Jed's expression was grim as he calculated their dwindling options. "He's smart, forces us to choose between burning alive or coming out where he can pick us off." Charlotte climbed onto the table and reached toward the ceiling, trying to douse the flames through the gaps between the logs. But the fire was spreading faster than she could fight it, and smoke was beginning to fill the cabin's interior. "There," Jed said suddenly, pointing toward the corner where he'd built a small root cellar beneath the floorboards. "We can get out through the tunnel." Charlotte stared at him in surprise. "What tunnel?" "Emergency exit. Dug it my second year here, after a pack of wolves had me trapped for 3 days. Jed was already pulling up the concealed floorboards, revealing a narrow passage that disappeared into darkness. "Comes out about 50 yards behind the cabin, near the creek." "Why didn't you mention this before?" "Because it means abandoning the cabin," Jed said simply. "Everything I built here, everything that kept me alive, it'll all burn." Charlotte understood the magnitude of what he was offering to sacrifice. This cabin wasn't just shelter, it was his sanctuary, his memorial to Sarah, his carefully constructed world of solitude and safety. Losing it would be like losing a part of himself. "We can rebuild," she said firmly. "Together." Jed's smile was brief but genuine. "Together," he agreed. The tunnel was cramped and dark, barely wide enough for a man of Jed's size to crawl through. Charlotte went first, feeling her way along the rough walls while Jed followed behind, his wounded shoulder making the journey even more difficult. Behind them, the cabin filled with smoke and flame as Coleman's plan reached its destructive conclusion. They emerged near the creek bank, concealed by a thick stand of willows that Jed had deliberately left untrimmed for exactly this purpose. From their hiding place, they could see Coleman silhouetted against the burning cabin, waiting for them to emerge from the front door that they would never use. "He thinks we're still inside," Charlotte whispered. "His mistake," Jed replied, raising his rifle, "and his last one." But before he could take the shot, Coleman spun toward their position, some instinct or sound alerting him to their presence. His revolver was already in his hand, and he fired even as he turned, the bullet cutting through the willow branches inches from Charlotte's head. Jed's return shot was immediate and deadly accurate. Coleman staggered, his gun falling from nerveless fingers, but somehow he remained on his feet. Blood spread across his shirt front, but his eyes burned with the fanatic determination of a man who refused to die easily. "You killed them all," he gasped, speaking to some phantom enemy that existed only in his mind. "Sarah, Thomas, all of them, just like Richard said you would." "Richard lied to you," Charlotte called out, stepping into view despite Jed's restraining hand, "just like he lied to everyone else." Coleman's laugh was wet and bitter. "Richard pays me $500 for your corpse, girl, worth dying for, that kind of money." He lunged toward them with the desperate strength of a mortally wounded animal, a hidden knife gleaming in his hand. Jed's rifle spoke again, but Coleman was already falling, his momentum carrying him forward in a final, futile attack. The knife fell harmlessly into the creek, and Marshal Jake Coleman lay still forever. His mercenary life ended beside the burning cabin that had been meant to be Jed and Charlotte's funeral pyre. "Is it over?" Charlotte asked, hardly daring to believe they'd survived. "For now," Jed said carefully, "but Coleman was just the hired help. Richard's still out there, and he won't give up until we're both dead." Charlotte looked back at the burning cabin, watching 15 years of Jed's life disappear into smoke and flame. The loss should have been devastating, but instead she felt only a strange sense of liberation. The past was burning away, leaving space for something new to grow. "Then we go to him," she said firmly. "We take the fight to Richard before he can send more killers after us." Jed stared at her in surprise. "Charlotte, he's got money, connections, influence, and I've got something he doesn't," she interrupted. "I know who he really is. I've seen his handwriting, heard his voice, watched him lie to my family's faces for months." Her eyes blazed with righteous fury. "And I have evidence that can destroy him." The wanted poster crinkled in her hand as she pulled it from her shirt, the forged signature clearly visible in the firelight. "This is our weapon, Jed. This is how we clear your name and make him pay for what he did to Thomas, to you, to all his victims." Jed looked from the burning cabin to the woman who'd become his partner in every sense that mattered, and saw not the refined Boston lady he'd rescued from the storm, but a mountain woman capable of anything necessary to protect the life they'd built together. Sarah's ring glinted on the ground between them, a final reminder of the past that was ending. But as Charlotte reached for his hand and he felt her fingers intertwine with his, Jed knew that some things were worth more than gold, worth more than safety or solitude, or the careful walls men built around wounded hearts. They had each other, they had the truth, and they had the kind of love that could survive anything the world threw at them. Richard Pemberton was about to learn that some forces of nature, like wildfire, like mountain storms, like two people determined to fight for their future, couldn't be bought or controlled or stopped. The real battle was just beginning. The new wooden sign read, "Holt Homestead Est, 1885, in Jed's careful carving. The letters filled with gold paint that caught the morning sunlight streaming through the pines. Charlotte traced the words with her finger as she stood beside their rebuilt cabin, marveling at how much their world had changed in the 6 months since Coleman's death and Richard Pemberton's eventual arrest. The trial had been a sensation in Kansas City, with newspapers across the territory covering the story of the corrupt lawyer who'd murdered his cousin and spent 7 years hunting an innocent man. Charlotte's testimony, supported by the forged wanted poster and Sarah Hutchins's corroborating account of the bounty hunter's crimes, had destroyed Richard's carefully constructed lies. Additional victims had come forward once the truth emerged, families who'd lost their land to Richard's fraudulent schemes, business partners who'd been cheated or threatened into silence. Richard Pemberton was now serving 25 years in territorial prison, his empire of theft and murder finally brought to justice. The judge had formally cleared Jed's name and issued a public apology for the years of wrongful persecution. Not that Jed particularly cared about official vindication. He'd found something more valuable than legal absolution in the love of the woman who'd stood beside him through everything. "Admiring your handiwork?" Charlotte asked, coming up behind him with 2 cups of coffee steaming in the crisp mountain air. "Admiring my partner," Jed replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "The sign's just wood and paint." Charlotte smiled at that, remembering the tentative woman who'd awakened in this man's cabin nearly a year ago. That person felt like a stranger now, some distant relative who'd lived a careful, constrained life in a world of social expectations and empty courtesies. The woman she'd become was harder, more capable, more herself than she'd ever imagined possible. The new cabin was larger than the original, built with Charlotte's needs in mind, as well as Jed's practical requirements. It had proper windows to let in light, shelves for the books she'd ordered from back east, and a kitchen area where she could practice the increasingly sophisticated cooking techniques Jed continued to teach her. Most importantly, it had 2 rocking chairs on the front porch where they could sit together in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the peaks in shades of gold and crimson. "Letter came in yesterday's mail delivery," Charlotte said, pulling an envelope from her apron pocket. "From my sister Margaret." Jed raised an eyebrow. Charlotte's family had eventually reconciled themselves to her choice to remain in Montana, though it had taken several strongly worded letters and a visit from Margaret herself to convince them she wasn't being held against her will. The fact that Charlotte was obviously happy, healthy, and thriving in her mountain life had gone a long way toward easing their concerns. "Good news or bad?" he asked. "Strange news," Charlotte said, opening the letter. She writes that Richard's conviction has had unexpected consequences back home. Apparently, several other prominent families have been exposed as his victims, and there's been a complete reorganization of the legal establishment in Kansas City. She read further, then looked up with an expression of amused satisfaction. "Oh, and the Pemberton mansion is being sold to pay restitution to Richard's victims. Margaret says they're turning it into a school for orphaned children." "Fitting end," Jed said with grim satisfaction. Thomas would have liked that. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, sipping their coffee and watching thunder graze in the small pasture Jed had fenced near the cabin. The horse was older now, moving with the careful dignity of an animal who'd earned his retirement, but he remained alert and companionable. Charlotte had grown to love the bay gelding almost as much as Jed did, appreciating his steady presence and quiet wisdom. "Any regrets?" Jed asked suddenly. Charlotte considered the question seriously, as she always did when he asked it. She'd given up wealth, social position, and family approval to build this life with him. Her hands were permanently stained and calloused from work, her skin weathered by mountain sun and wind, her wardrobe reduced to practical clothes that could withstand the demands of frontier living. "None," she said firmly, "not a single one." And she meant it. The woman who'd fled her engagement to Richard Pemberton had been searching for something she couldn't name: purpose, authenticity, the chance to discover who she really was beneath the layers of expectation and propriety. She'd found all of that and more in the arms of a mountain man who'd taught her that love wasn't about comfort or security, but about finding someone willing to face life's challenges as your partner. "What about you?" she asked in return. "Do you miss the solitude?" Jed's laugh was warm and genuine. "I thought I would. 15 years of silence takes some getting used to breaking. But having someone to share the sunrise with, someone to talk through problems with, someone who makes even the simplest tasks feel like adventures." He shook his head. "I can't imagine going back to the way things were." Charlotte leaned against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of wood smoke and leather that would always mean home to her. "Good thing you won't have to." They were interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats on the trail leading up to their homestead. Visitors were still rare, though not as uncommon as they'd been in Jed's solitary years. Word had spread through the territory about the couple who'd brought down Richard Pemberton's criminal empire, and they occasionally received visits from travelers seeking advice, assistance, or simply the chance to meet the legendary mountain man and his remarkable wife. The rider who emerged from the trees was Sarah Hutchins, the schoolteacher whose life they'd saved during the confrontation with Coleman's men. She'd become a regular visitor and close friend, one of the few people who understood what they'd been through together. "Morning, folks," Sarah called out, dismounting with the easy grace of someone who'd adapted well to frontier life. "Brought news from town, and figured you'd want to hear it firsthand." "What kind of news?" Charlotte asked, already moving to take Sarah's horse to the small stable. "The territorial governor's office sent a representative to Copper Falls," Sarah said, her eyes bright with excitement. "They're looking for experienced law enforcement officers to help establish order in the mining camps up north. Apparently, your reputation for handling difficult situations has reached some important ears." Jed frowned slightly. "They offering me a badge?" "More than that," Sarah said. "They're offering you and Charlotte the chance to establish a new settlement in the high country." government backing, supplies, authority to recruit families and create a proper community. Charlotte felt her pulse quicken. The idea of helping to build something new, of using their hard-won knowledge to create a place where people could live safely and prosper, appealed to every instinct she'd developed since leaving Boston. What would it involve? Jed asked, though Charlotte could see the interest stirring behind his careful expression. Survey work, site selection, recruiting suitable families, establishing basic law and order, Sarah enumerated. Dangerous work, but important work. The kind of thing that could make a real difference in how this territory develops. Charlotte and Jed exchanged a long look, communicating in the wordless way they'd developed over months of shared challenges and decisions. The quiet life they'd built here was precious, but it was also preparation for something larger, for the chance to use their unique combination of skills and experience to help others find their own versions of hope and home in the wilderness. "We'll need to think about it," Jed said finally. "Of course," Sarah said, "but don't think too long. The governor's man said they need an answer within the month." After Sarah left, Charlotte and Jed spent the afternoon discussing the opportunity, weighing the risks and benefits of leaving their hard-won sanctuary for a new adventure. By evening, they'd reached the decision they both knew they'd make from the moment Sarah had described the offer. "One more year here," Charlotte said as they sat in their rocking chairs, watching the sunset paint the mountains in familiar colors. "One more year to enjoy what we've built, and then we'll see about building something even bigger." "One more year," Jed agreed, reaching for her hand. As darkness settled over their homestead and the first stars appeared above the peaks, Charlotte reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She'd come to the mountains running from a life that felt like a beautiful prison, and she'd found freedom in the arms of a man who'd forgotten how to hope. Together, they'd faced killers and corrupt officials, survived storms and gunfights, built a home from raw wilderness and a love from wounded hearts. They'd learned that some things like trust, like courage, like the kind of love that grew stronger under pressure, couldn't be bought or inherited or awarded by society's approval. The wooden sign beside their door bore witness to their achievement: Holt Homestead Est, 1885. But the real monument to their love wasn't carved in wood or built from stone. It lived in the way they faced each new day as partners, in the quiet confidence they'd found in each other's strength, in the knowledge that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would meet them together. In the high country of Montana Territory, where pine forests met jagged peaks and the wilderness tested every soul who dared to call it home, Jedediah Holt and Charlotte Whitmore had discovered that the strongest foundations were built not from timber and stone, but from trust, determination, and the kind of enduring love that could survive anything the world had to offer. Their story was far from over, it was just beginning.